Everyone said she would end up crazy like her mother, and this one mistake proved them right. Welcome. Remember to subscribe and activate the notifications. Enjoy. The line between reality and her worst fears was blurring, and Isabella was terrified. Everyone had always said she would turn out just like her mother, and now, as she felt her grip on reality slipping, she feared they were right. The one mistake that proved it was staring her in the face. She sat in the corner of her small apartment, knees drawn to her chest, her eyes fixed on the shards of a broken glass scattered across the floor. Her hands were still trembling, the sensation of the glass slipping from her fingers replaying in her mind. It had been an innocent mistake, an accident, but to Isabella it was a sign, a prelude to something darker. She had seen the same thing happen countless times growing up. Her mother's fits of rage, the shattering of objects, the chaos that followed. It was always the beginning of another episode, another reminder of the instability that had defined Isabella's childhood. The apartment was silent now, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. But inside Isabella's mind, there was no quiet. Her thoughts raced, tumbling over each other, each one louder and more insistent than the last. She had been trying so hard to keep it together, to hold on to the semblance of normalcy she had built around herself. But tonight she had let her guard down for just a moment, and the darkness had found its way in. She knew she should clean up the mess, pick up the pieces of the glass, and move on. But she couldn't move. Her body felt heavy, weighed down by the invisible chains of her past. The fear was like a living thing, coiling around her chest, tightening its grip with each passing second. She could almost hear her father's voice, sharp and cold, echoing in her head. "You're just like her, Isabella. You'll end up just like your mother. It's only a matter of time." The memory of his words stung as much now as they did when she was a child. Ethan had never been kind, not after Sophia's illness took hold. He had been a different man once, loving, attentive, a devoted husband and father. But Sophia's diagnosis had changed everything. Her mood swings, her unpredictable behavior had worn him down. Over time, his love turned to resentment, his patience to anger. He had never understood her illness, and his frustration had found an easy target in Isabella, who bore a striking resemblance to her mother. Isabella could still remember the look in his eyes, the way he would stare at her with a mix of pity and disgust, as if seeing Sophia's reflection. He never said it outright, but Isabella knew he blamed her for what had happened, for the way their lives had fallen apart. And she had blamed herself too. She had been a child, unable to understand what was happening, only knowing that her world was unraveling and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Her mother's illness had dominated their lives. Some days, Sophia was the loving, caring mother Isabella adored, cooking breakfast, laughing with them, making everything feel safe and normal. But those days never lasted. The darkness would return, swallowing Sophia whole, turning her into someone Isabella barely recognized. The manic episodes were the worst. Sophia's energy would surge, her emotions swinging wildly from euphoria to anger. She would stay up all night talking to herself, writing furiously in her journals, convinced that she was on the brink of some great revelation. And then, just as quickly, the depression would set in, dragging her down into a pit of despair where no one could reach her. Isabella had learned to read the signs, to anticipate the shifts in her mother's behavior. She became hypervigilant, always on edge, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. She would tiptoe around the house trying to keep everything in order, hoping that maybe, just maybe, if she did everything right, her mother would stay calm. But it never worked. The episodes came regardless of what she did, leaving Isabella feeling powerless and afraid. Now, as she grew older, the fear of becoming like her mother took root in her mind. She would watch Sophia's outbursts, the way she would scream and cry, and wonder if that was her future too. Her father didn't help. His anger at Sophia often spilled over onto Isabella. He would snap at her, criticize her, comparing her to her mother whenever she showed the slightest hint of emotion. "Stop being so dramatic," he would say. "You're just like her." And Isabella believed him. She saw the same traits in herself, the same intensity, the same sensitivity, and it terrified her. When Isabella was 13, everything changed. One night during one of Sophia's manic episodes, an argument broke out between her parents. Sophia was in one of her highs, her energy manic, her voice shrill as she accused Ethan of trying to control her, of not understanding her genius. Ethan had lost his temper, shouting back, his face red with anger. Isabella and Daniel had watched from the top of the stairs, too scared to intervene. The argument escalated quickly, and in a moment of rage, Sophia grabbed a knife from the kitchen counter, waving it wildly in the air. Isabella would never forget the look of horror on Ethan's face, the way he backed away, hands up in a gesture of surrender. Sophia's eyes were wild, unfocused, as if she didn't even see him. It was as if she was lost in her own world, a place where none of them could reach her. Isabella had acted on instinct, rushing down the stairs to grab her mother's arm, to stop her from doing something she couldn't take back. In the struggle, Sophia had slipped, and the knife had cut across Isabella's arm, leaving a jagged scar that would never fade. That night had been the breaking point. Ethan had called the police, and Sophia was taken away, committed to a psychiatric hospital. Isabella and Daniel were sent to live with their aunt while Ethan tried to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Sophia's absence left a void that nothing could fill. Ethan's resentment towards Isabella grew stronger, fueled by his own guilt and fear. He withdrew from her completely, barely acknowledging her presence, leaving her to navigate her pain and confusion alone. Isabella carried the weight of that night with her always. The scar on her arm was a constant reminder of the chaos that had consumed their family. It was also a reminder of her own vulnerability, of the fear that she could lose control just as her mother had. She tried to bury those fears, to push them down, but they were always there, lurking beneath the surface, ready to rise at any moment. Now, sitting in her apartment, the broken glass glittering on the floor, Isabella felt those fears rise up again. She had tried so hard to build a life for herself, to prove that she was different, that she could be normal. She had gone to college, gotten a job, found a place of her own. But no matter how far she ran, she couldn't escape the shadow of her past. The anxiety, the panic, the sense of impending doom. It was all still there, just waiting for her to slip up. Tonight had been a simple mistake. She had been tired, distracted, and the glass had slipped from her fingers. But to Isabella, it was more than that. It was a sign that she was losing control, that the darkness was winning. She could feel it creeping in, whispering to her, telling her that it was only a matter of time before she became just like her mother. And maybe everyone was right. Isabella closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She couldn't let this consume her. She had to find a way to hold on, to keep herself together. But how? The fear was so strong, so overpowering. She felt like she was drowning, pulled under by a tide she couldn't fight. As the night wore on, Isabella remained in her corner, the broken glass untouched. She knew she couldn't stay like this forever, that she needed to get up, to clean up the mess, to move forward. But she couldn't find the strength. She felt trapped, paralyzed by the weight of her own mind. At that moment, Isabella realized something had to change. She couldn't keep living in fear, couldn't keep letting the past control her. There had to be a way out, a way to break free from the cycle she was trapped in. She didn't know what that way was, but she knew she had to find it. She couldn't become her mother. She couldn't let the darkness win. With a trembling hand, Isabella reached for her phone, her fingers scrolling through the contacts. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen. Who could she call? Who would understand? Her friends had drifted away, tired of her constant anxiety and need for reassurance. Her family was no better. Her father would only see this as proof that he was right about her all along. Daniel, he had his own life, his own problems. She couldn't burden him with this. She needed to do this on her own. She needed to find her own way. Her eyes landed on an app she had downloaded months ago but never opened, a meditation app. She had downloaded it on a whim, thinking it might help her relax, but had never found the time or the courage to try it. Now it seemed like a lifeline, a small step towards something different. Isabella opened the app, her heart pounding in her chest. She followed the prompts, closing her eyes, focusing on her breath as the calming voice guided her through a simple meditation. At first, her mind resisted, thoughts racing, but gradually she began to relax. Her breathing slowed, her heartbeat steadied. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was a moment of peace. As the meditation ended, Isabella opened her eyes, feeling a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. Maybe this was the start of finding a way out of the darkness. Maybe she could fight the fear, take back control of her life. It would be a long journey, she knew that, but she was willing to try. She had to. She couldn't let herself become the person she feared. She couldn't let the past define her. Isabella took a deep breath, stood up, and began to pick up the pieces of the broken glass. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she was determined to find out. One step at a time, she would reclaim her life, her identity. She would prove to herself and to everyone else that she was more than her mother's daughter, more than the fears that had haunted her for so long. She would find her way back to herself, and in doing so, she would find her way back to the light. The following weeks passed in a haze for Isabella. She found herself drifting through each day, weighed down by an unshakable sense of dread. The broken glass incident seemed to have opened a door she could no longer close, and her anxiety spilled out, flooding every corner of her mind. Every morning she would wake up with a tight knot in her stomach, the persistent thought that something was wrong. Each night she would lie awake for hours, her mind replaying every small mistake, every perceived failure, each one more evidence of her impending unraveling. She tried to keep up appearances, to act as if everything was fine. At work, she forced herself to smile, to engage in small talk with her colleagues, but she felt like a stranger in her own skin. Every conversation, every task seemed to take monumental effort, as if she were moving through quicksand. Her job in customer service, which had once been manageable, now felt like a battlefield. Each phone call, each interaction, was a potential minefield of stress. She was constantly on edge, terrified of making a mistake, of doing something that would confirm her worst fears. The panic attacks started subtly at first, a slight quickening of her heartbeat, a tightening in her chest. She would feel lightheaded, as if the ground beneath her was shifting. Then came the full-blown attacks, hitting her without warning. Her heart would race, her vision would blur, and she would feel as if she were being smothered. The first time it happened, she was in the grocery store, standing in line. One moment she was fine, the next she was gasping for breath, clutching the edge of the counter, her vision tunneling. She had fled the store, leaving her groceries behind, barely making it to her car before collapsing into sobs. After that, the attacks came more frequently. She began to avoid crowded places, fearful that she might have another episode in public. She stopped going out with friends, declining invitations with vague excuses. The isolation only made things worse, leaving her alone with her thoughts, which grew darker by the day. The walls of her apartment, once a refuge, now felt like a prison. She would sit on the couch, staring at the clock, the minutes ticking by with agonizing slowness. The voice of doubt became her constant companion, whispering insidiously in her ear. It told her she was weak, that she was losing her mind, that everyone around her could see it. She began to second-guess herself constantly, questioning her every action, her every thought. She started avoiding mirrors, unable to face the person she saw staring back at her. She was afraid of the desperation in her own eyes, afraid that she would see her mother's face reflected back at her. Her job performance began to suffer. She was late more often, her responses to customers became curt and distracted. Her manager noticed the change and called her in for a meeting. Isabella sat across from him, hands clasped tightly in her lap, trying to keep her voice steady as he expressed his concerns. He was polite but firm, suggesting that she might need some time off to get herself together. The words stung, even though she knew he was right. She nodded numbly, agreeing to take a leave of absence, feeling a sense of failure wash over her. She had always prided herself on being reliable, competent, But now she couldn't even manage a simple job. The days without work stretched endlessly. Isabella found it harder and harder to get out of bed. The weight of her own mind felt too heavy to bear. She would wake up, the morning light filtering through the curtains, and lie there, staring at the ceiling, unable to summon the energy to move. Her thoughts were a constant loop of negativity, telling her she was a burden, a failure, that she was just like her mother. She stopped answering her phone, ignoring calls from friends and family. Her brother Daniel had called a few times, leaving messages asking if she was okay. Isabella couldn't bring herself to respond. She didn't want him to see how far she had fallen, didn't want to burden him with her problems. He had his own life, his own career. He had managed to escape the shadow of their past, and she didn't want to drag him back into it. Her father's voice haunted her. Even in his absence, Ethan's disapproval was a constant presence in her mind. She could almost see him, standing over her, arms crossed, shaking his head. "I knew this would happen," he would say. "You're just like her, weak, unstable, a disappointment." The words cut deep, reinforcing every doubt, every fear. Isabella knew she couldn't live up to his expectations, but she couldn't stop trying. The harder she tried to prove him wrong, the more she seemed to fail. One night, as she sat alone in her darkened apartment, the fear finally became too much. She could feel herself spiraling, her thoughts racing out of control. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breathing rapid and shallow. She felt as if she were suffocating, trapped in a space that was closing in around her. She stood up, pacing the room, her hands shaking. Her mind was a whirlwind of panic, a thousand thoughts swirling, none of them making sense. She felt as if she were on the edge of a precipice, about to fall into a void from which there was no return. Desperate for a way out, Isabella grabbed her coat and left the apartment, the cold night air hitting her like a slap. She walked aimlessly through the streets, the city lights blurring around her. Her steps were unsteady, her vision clouded by tears. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to get away, to escape the prison of her own mind. She found herself at the park, the one she used to visit as a child. It was nearly empty at this hour, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the breeze. She wandered through the familiar paths, memories flooding back. She had come here with her mother once, on one of Sophia's good days. They had sat on the bench by the pond, feeding the ducks, laughing together. Isabella had felt safe, loved. She had believed for a moment that everything would be okay. Now that memory felt like a lifetime ago. She was no longer that hopeful child. She was an adult, lost and broken, with no idea how to fix herself. She found the bench by the pond and sank down, burying her face in her hands. The tears came then, unstoppable, pouring out of her in waves. She cried for her mother, for the life they had lost, for the person she had become. She cried for the fear that consumed her, for the belief that she was doomed to follow the same path. As the sobs racked her body, Isabella felt a sense of release, as if the tears were washing away the years of pain and pain she had kept locked inside. She cried until she had no more tears left, her body exhausted, her mind strangely quiet. In the stillness that followed, a thought came to her, quiet but insistent. She couldn't go on like this. She needed help. The realization was both terrifying and liberating. For so long, she had tried to handle everything on her own, convinced that asking for help was a sign of weakness. But now she saw that she couldn't do it alone. The fear, the anxiety, the sense of being trapped in a cycle she couldn't break, it was too much for her to bear alone. She needed someone to guide her, to show her that there was a way out. She didn't know where to start, didn't know who to turn to. But the thought of finding help was enough to give her a glimmer of hope. She had hit rock bottom, but maybe, just maybe, there was a way up. Maybe she wasn't destined to become her mother. Maybe she could find a different path, a way to heal. As she sat on the bench watching the reflection of the moon ripple on the surface of the pond, Isabella made a decision. Tomorrow, she would take the first step. She would find a therapist, someone she could talk to. She would open herself up to the possibility that she could be helped, that she could be saved from the darkness that had consumed her. The thought was terrifying, but it was also a lifeline. She had been drowning for so long, but now she felt as if she had found something to hold on to. She wasn't alone. There were people who understood, who could help her navigate the tangled web of her mind. She didn't have to do this by herself. The night air was cold, but Isabella felt a warmth spread through her, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know if she would ever be free of the fear that had haunted her for so long. But for the first time, she felt a spark of hope, a belief that she could find her way out of the darkness. She stood up, brushing the tears from her face. The path ahead was still uncertain, but she was ready to take the first step. She was ready to fight for her life, for her sanity, for the chance to live free from the shadow of her past. She would prove to herself and to everyone else that she was more than her mother's daughter, more than the sum of her fears. She would find her way back to the light, one step at a time. Isabella walked away from the park, her steps steady, her mind clear. She didn't know where the journey would take her, but she knew one thing. She was ready to begin. The morning light filtered through the curtains of Isabella's apartment, casting a soft glow on the walls. Isabella sat at her kitchen table, staring at her phone. She had opened the browser to look for therapists in her area, but the screen remained untouched. Her fingers hovered over the phone, hesitant. Reaching out for help was a terrifying step, but the memory of her breakdown in the park lingered in her mind. She knew she couldn't keep living like this. Finally, she summoned the courage to type in the search terms, her eyes scanning the list of names and clinics that appeared. Her heart pounded as she clicked through the profiles, reading about different therapists, their specialties, their approaches. It all seemed overwhelming, but one name stood out to her: Dr. Claire Matthews. Her profile spoke about her experience with anxiety, trauma, and mindfulness-based therapy. There was a kindness in her eyes, a gentleness that drew Isabella in. Without allowing herself time to second-guess, Isabella clicked on the contact form and scheduled an appointment. The week leading up to her first session was a blur of anxiety and anticipation. Isabella went through the motions of her day, but her thoughts were consumed by what was to come. She had no idea what to expect, but she knew she needed this. The day of the appointment, she could hardly eat, her stomach in knots. She arrived at the office early, her palms sweaty as she sat in the waiting room, the ticking of the clock on the wall, the only sound in the quiet space. When Dr. Matthews finally called her in, Isabella felt as if she were walking to her own execution. But as she stepped into the office, the soft colors and warm lighting eased some of her tension. Dr. Matthews greeted her with a smile, her voice calm and soothing. Isabella took a seat, her hands nervously twisting in her lap. She felt exposed, vulnerable, but there was something about Dr. Matthews that made her feel she could trust her. The session began with simple questions about Isabella's background, her family, her job. Isabella answered hesitantly at first, but as the minutes passed, she found herself opening up more. Dr. Matthews listened intently, nodding, her gaze never wavering. There was no judgment in her eyes, only understanding. For the first time, Isabella felt like someone truly heard her, that her fears and anxieties were valid, not just figments of her imagination. As Isabella talked about her mother's illness, the way it had shaped her childhood, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She spoke of the fear that had followed her all her life, the belief that she was destined to become like her mother, that she would lose control. She talked about her father's rejection, his words that had haunted her for so long. The more she spoke, the more she realized how much she had been holding inside, how much pain she had buried. Dr. Matthews listened, asking gentle questions that encouraged Isabella to dig deeper. She helped Isabella see that her fears, while understandable, were not an inevitable fate. She talked about the nature of anxiety, how it feeds on itself, how it can create a cycle of fear that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. She introduced Isabella to the concept of mindfulness, of being present in the moment, of recognizing her thoughts and feelings without letting them define her. Isabella left the session feeling emotionally drained but lighter, as if a part of the burden she had carried for so long had been lifted. Dr. Matthews had given her a glimmer of hope, a belief that maybe she wasn't doomed to repeat her mother's fate. There were ways to manage her anxiety, to break free from the cycle that had trapped her for so long. It would take time, she knew, but she was willing to try. Dr. Matthews suggested Isabella keep a journal, a place to write down her thoughts, her fears, her hopes. At first, Isabella was skeptical. She had never been one to keep a diary, but she decided to give it a try. She bought a simple notebook and a pen, and each night she would sit down and write. The act of putting her thoughts on paper felt therapeutic, a way to release the tension that built up inside her. Her entries were raw, unfiltered, a stream of consciousness that allowed her to process her emotions. She wrote about her sessions with Dr. Matthews, about the memories that surfaced, the realizations she came to. She wrote about her mother, about the love she still felt for her despite everything. She wrote about her father, about the pain of his rejection, the longing for his approval. She wrote about her fear of becoming like her mother, about the moments when she felt she was slipping, and the hope that she could find a way to hold on. As the weeks passed, Isabella began to notice small changes in herself. The panic attacks became less frequent, her anxiety less overwhelming. The mindfulness exercises Dr. Matthews taught her helped her stay grounded, to focus on her breathing when she felt the fear rising. She found that she could challenge the negative thoughts, question them, rather than accepting them as the truth. She started to see herself not as a victim of her past, but as someone who had the power to shape her own future. It was during this time that Isabella discovered yoga. One afternoon as she walked through her neighborhood, she noticed a flyer for a local yoga studio taped to a lamppost. The words caught her eye: find peace of mind, clarity, and a path to self-discovery. The idea intrigued her. She had heard about the benefits of yoga, how it could help with anxiety and stress. Maybe this was something that could help her. She took the flyer and made a note of the studio's address. The first time she stepped into the yoga studio, Isabella felt a sense of calm wash over her. The space was small but inviting, with soft lighting and soothing music playing in the background. The smell of incense filled the air, and the walls were decorated with calming images of nature. The instructor, a woman named Emily, greeted Isabella with a warm smile, welcoming her to the class. Isabella unrolled a borrowed yoga mat and took a place at the back of the room, feeling both nervous and excited. As the class began, Isabella focused on the instructor's voice, following the slow, deliberate movements. She felt awkward at first, unsure of herself, but as she moved through the poses, a sense of ease came over her. She focused on her breath, on the way her body felt, the stretch of her muscles, the grounding of her feet on the mat. For the duration of the class, her mind was quiet. There were no racing thoughts, no worries about the future, just the present moment. When the class ended, Isabella lay on her mat in Savasana, the final resting pose. Her body felt relaxed, her mind at peace. She could hear the gentle sound of her breath, feel the steady beat of her heart. In that moment, she felt a connection to herself that she hadn't felt in years. It was as if a part of her that had been lost was coming back to life. Yoga became a regular part of Isabella's routine. She attended classes 3 times a week, finding comfort in the familiar space, the gentle guidance of the instructor. She began to look forward to the time she spent on the mat, the sense of calm it brought her. It wasn't just about the physical exercise. It was about the connection to her body, her breath, her inner self. Each class was a step towards healing, a way to rebuild the parts of herself that had been broken. The more Isabella practiced, the more she noticed the changes within her. Her body grew stronger, more flexible, and so did her mind. She felt more grounded, more centered. The panic attacks became rare, the sense of dread less constant. She began to feel a sense of control over her life, over her emotions. She still had moments of fear, of doubt, but she no longer felt powerless in the face of them. Isabella's sessions with Dr. Matthews continued, each one peeling back another layer of her past, helping her to understand the patterns that had shaped her. She began to see her mother's illness not as a curse, but as a part of who she was. Sophia had been a victim of circumstances beyond her control, and that didn't make her weak or less worthy of love. Isabella started to forgive her mother, to let go of the anger and resentment she had held on to for so long. She also began to forgive herself. For years, she had blamed herself for not being able to save her mother, for not being able to fix her family. She had carried the guilt of that night with the knife, the scar on her arm a constant reminder of her perceived failure. But through therapy, she came to realize that she was not responsible for her mother's actions, that she had been a child caught in a situation far beyond her control. She could let go of the guilt, the shame, and allow herself to heal. Isabella's world started to open up in ways she hadn't expected. She began to reconnect with old friends, reaching out to those she had pushed away in her darkest moments. She joined a support group for people dealing with anxiety, finding comfort in the shared experiences of others. She no longer felt alone, no longer felt like she was the only one struggling. There were others who understood, who had faced their own battles and come out the other side. One evening after a particularly uplifting yoga class, Isabella found herself walking through a park, the same park she had broken down in weeks ago. The air was cool, the sun setting in the sky, casting a golden glow over the trees. She sat on the same bench by the pond, her heart calm, her mind clear. She watched the ripples on the water, the reflection of the sky, and felt a sense of peace. At that moment, Isabella realized how far she had come. She had been to the brink of despair, had faced her deepest fears, and yet she was still here, still standing. She had found a strength within herself she hadn't known existed, a resilience that had carried her through the darkness. She had taken the first steps towards healing, towards reclaiming her life, and she knew she was capable of taking many more. Isabella knew there would still be challenges ahead, that the journey was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. She had found tools to help her, had found people who supported her, who believed in her. She had found a sense of purpose, a desire to continue growing, to continue healing. She was no longer defined by her past, by the fears that had haunted her. She was creating a new narrative, one where she was in control, one where she was free. As she sat on the bench, the sky darkening above her, Isabella made a promise to herself. She would continue to fight, continue to heal. She would not let her past dictate her future. She would be more than her mother's daughter, more than the sum of her fears. She would be Isabella, a woman who had faced her darkest moments and found the courage to rise above them. Isabella stood up, taking one last look at the pond before turning to leave. She walked away from the park, her steps light, her heart open. She knew she was on a journey, one that would take time, but she was ready. She was ready to embrace the future, to embrace herself, and to find the happiness and peace she had always deserved. Isabella's journey to healing had brought her a newfound sense of strength and peace. But the deeper she delved into her own recovery, the more she realized that there were still unresolved wounds she needed to address. Therapy and yoga had given her the tools to manage her anxiety and fears, but the shadows of her past still lingered. Her father's rejection, the painful memories of her mother's illness, and the deep-seated belief that she was destined to repeat the same patterns. All these needed to be confronted. The sessions with Dr. Matthews began to focus more on her relationship with her father. Isabella had avoided talking about him too much, preferring to focus on her own struggles. But Dr. Matthews gently pushed her to explore the impact Ethan's behavior had on her. Isabella had always seen him as a cold, unfeeling figure, a man who had abandoned her emotionally when she needed him the most. But now she began to wonder if there was more to his story, more to his anger and resentment than she had understood. One day, after a particularly intense session, Isabella sat in her car, thinking about her father. She hadn't spoken to him in months. Their last conversation had been a strained, uncomfortable exchange that ended with him criticizing her choice to take time off work. He had called her lazy, said she was wasting her potential, that she was letting herself go. His words had stung, as they always did, and Isabella had hung up, vowing to avoid him for as long as she could. But now, as she sat in her car, she felt a tug of curiosity. She knew she couldn't move forward until she dealt with the issues between them. She had spent so many years letting his words define her, letting his opinions shape her self-image. She needed to understand why he was the way he was, why he had treated her the way he did. Maybe if she understood him, she could begin to forgive him and herself. Isabella took a deep breath and picked up her phone. Her hands shook as she scrolled through her contacts, finding her father's number. She hesitated, her finger hovering over the call button. Part of her wanted to put the phone down, to avoid the confrontation she knew was coming. But another part of her, the part that had grown stronger through therapy and yoga, pushed her forward. She pressed the call button and held her breath as the phone rang. Ethan answered after a few rings, his voice gruff and wary. Isabella could hear the surprise in his tone when he realized it was her. She took a deep breath and asked if they could meet. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, she thought he might refuse. But then he agreed, his voice softer, almost hesitant. They arranged to meet at a small cafe in town the following day. Isabella barely slept that night, her mind racing with possibilities. What would she say? How would he react? She knew the conversation wouldn't be easy, but she felt a sense of resolve. This was something she needed to do for her own sake. She needed to confront the past, to find closure. The next day, Isabella arrived at the cafe early, her stomach in knots. She ordered a coffee and took a seat by the window, her eyes scanning the street outside. When Ethan arrived, he looked older than she remembered, his face lined with the weight of years. He spotted her and walked over, his expression guarded. They exchanged pleasantries, the conversation stilted and awkward. Isabella could see the tension in his eyes, the way he avoided looking directly at her. She could feel the old patterns trying to reassert themselves. The fear and resentment that had colored their relationship for so long. But she reminded herself of why she was here, of the purpose of this meeting. She began by asking him about his work, how he was doing. Ethan responded with short, clipped answers, clearly uncomfortable. Isabella took a deep breath and decided to dive in. She asked him about their past, about the way he had treated her growing up. She spoke about her fears, her belief that she was destined to end up like her mother, and how his words had affected her. For a moment, Ethan said nothing. He stared down at his coffee, his jaw clenched. Isabella's heart pounded in her chest, her hands trembling. She had expected anger, denial, maybe even dismissal. But when Ethan finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost broken. He admitted that he had been afraid of losing Sophia, afraid of losing control, afraid of the future. He had taken his fear out on Isabella, projecting his own insecurities onto her. Ethan spoke of his own upbringing, how he had been taught to see emotions as weakness, to value control above all else. When Sophia's illness took hold, he had felt powerless, unable to fix her, unable to keep their family together. His love for her had turned into resentment, his frustration spilling over onto Isabella. He admitted that he had seen too much of Sophia and Isabella, and it had frightened him. He didn't know how to deal with it, so he had pushed her away, convinced that it was the only way to protect himself. As Isabella listened to her father's confession, a mix of emotions washed over her. Anger, sadness, empathy. She realized that Ethan's treatment of her had less to do with who she was and more to do with his own unresolved pain. He had been trying to protect himself from the fear of losing control, from the fear of vulnerability. In his own way, he had been just as scared as she was. The conversation continued, both of them opening up in ways they never had before. Isabella spoke of her struggles, her journey to find healing, her desire to break free from the cycle of fear. Ethan listened, his eyes showing a glimmer of understanding. For the first time, they were speaking to each other not as father and daughter, but as two people trying to make sense of their pain. By the time they left the cafe, Isabella felt a sense of relief. The conversation hadn't magically fixed everything, but it was a start. She had faced her father, had spoken her truth, and in doing so, had taken a step towards healing. She didn't know what their relationship would look like in the future, but she was no longer defined by his judgment. She was free to be herself, to continue her journey without the weight of his expectations. In the days that followed, Isabella felt a shift within herself. She no longer carried the same sense of guilt, the same fear of becoming like her mother. She understood that her father's treatment of her was not a reflection of her worth, but of his own fears. She had spent so many years letting his voice drown out her own, but now she was ready to listen to herself. Her sessions with Dr. Matthews continued, but the focus began to shift. They talked about Isabella's future, her dreams, her goals. For so long, Isabella had been consumed by her fear of repeating the past. But now she was ready to look forward. She wanted to continue growing, to continue healing. She wanted to help others who were struggling, to use her experiences to make a difference. Isabella decided to become a certified yoga instructor. Yoga had been a lifeline for her, a way to connect with herself, to find peace in the chaos. She wanted to share that gift with others, to create a space where people could come to heal, to find their own strength. She enrolled in a teacher training program, immersing herself in the study of yoga, mindfulness, and the mind-body connection. The training was intense, both physically and emotionally. Isabella found herself pushed to her limits, but she embraced the challenge. Each day she learned more about herself, about her body, about the power of the mind. She began to see herself not as a victim of her past, but as a survivor, a woman who had faced her darkest moments and come out stronger. As Isabella neared the end of her training, she began to teach her own classes. She rented a small studio space, transforming it into a sanctuary of calm and healing. Her classes attracted a diverse group of people, each with their own stories, their own struggles. Isabella welcomed them all, creating an environment where they could feel safe, supported, and understood. She focused on trauma-informed yoga, using her own experiences to guide her teaching. She encouraged her students to listen to their bodies, to be kind to themselves, to find the balance between effort and ease. She shared her own journey, not as a story of overcoming, but as a story of ongoing growth. She wanted her students to know that healing was not a destination, but a journey, one that required patience, compassion, and a willingness to face the shadows. Isabella's classes became a refuge for many. People came to her studio not just for the physical practice, but for the sense of community, the sense of belonging. They came to find peace, to find themselves, to find a way to heal. Isabella watched as her students transformed, as they found their own strength, their own resilience. She saw herself in each of them, saw the struggles they faced, and felt a deep sense of fulfillment in helping them on their journey. Isabella's life was far from perfect. There were still moments of doubt, days when the old fears would resurface, but now she had the tools to manage them. She knew how to ground herself, how to reconnect with her breath, how to find the calm in the storm. She no longer feared becoming like her mother. She no longer let her father's voice dictate her worth. She had found her own voice, her own sense of self, and she was ready to embrace whatever the future held. One evening, after a long day of teaching, Isabella sat in her studio, the quiet settling around her like a comforting blanket. She thought about the path that had led her here, the journey from darkness to light. She thought about her mother, about her father, about the pain and the healing. She thought about the people she had met along the way, the students who had become friends, the community they had built together. She realized that she had found something she had been searching for all her life, a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging. She was no longer defined by her past, no longer trapped by the fear of what might be. She was living her life on her own terms, embracing each moment, each challenge with an open heart. As Isabella closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, she felt a sense of gratitude. She had come a long way, but her journey was just beginning. She knew there would still be obstacles, still be moments of doubt, but she also knew that she had the strength to face them, the resilience to keep moving forward. She had found her way back to herself, and in doing so, she had found the courage to live. Isabella's journey had brought her a sense of peace she had never known before. She had faced her past, confronted the fears that had once consumed her, and found her own path to healing. Her yoga studio became more than just a place for physical exercise. It was a sanctuary where people could come to find solace and connection. It was here that Isabella found her true calling, helping others navigate their own darkness. just as she had done. As Isabella continued to grow and heal, she noticed how the community she had built began to flourish. Her students trusted her, opening up about their own struggles and fears. Isabella listened to their stories, offering support and understanding, drawing from her own experiences. Her compassion was genuine, her empathy real. She knew what it was like to feel lost, to be trapped in a cycle of fear. She wanted to be the person for her students that she had once needed, someone who believed in them, who saw their potential even when they couldn't see it themselves. Her brother Daniel had noticed the changes in Isabella. He admired her strength and her determination to heal and help others. They began to reconnect, slowly rebuilding the bond that had been fractured by their chaotic upbringing. Daniel had his own struggles, shadows from their past that still lingered. But with Isabella's encouragement, he began his own journey of self-discovery, attending her yoga classes and finding solace in the practice that had helped his sister so much. One evening, after a yoga class, Daniel stayed behind, helping Isabella clean up the studio. As they worked together, Isabella felt a sense of gratitude. For so long, she had felt isolated, disconnected from her family. Now she and Daniel were closer than they had ever been. They talked about their mother, about their memories of her, both good and bad. Isabella found herself sharing things she had never told anyone, not even her therapist. Small moments of joy and love that had been buried under the weight of fear. Daniel listened, sharing his own memories, and together they began to heal the wounds of their childhood. Isabella also made the decision to reach out to her father. Their meeting at the cafe had opened a door she hadn't thought possible. She realized that while their relationship would never be perfect, there was room for understanding and forgiveness. She invited him to one of her yoga classes, unsure if he would accept. To her surprise, Ethan showed up, standing awkwardly at the back of the studio. He was stiff, out of place, but he was there, and that meant more to Isabella than she could express. After the class, they sat together, talking quietly. Isabella could see the effort he was making, the tentative steps towards repairing their relationship. They didn't discuss the past or delve into the pain that had driven them apart. Instead, they focused on the present, on the progress they were both making. Isabella saw a softness in her father's eyes that she hadn't seen in years, a hint of the man he used to be before everything fell apart. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was a start, and that was enough. As Isabella's relationships with her family healed, she felt a growing desire to open her heart to new possibilities. For so long, she had closed herself off, convinced that she was unworthy of love, that she was too broken to be in a relationship. But as she watched the students in her classes, the connections they formed, the love they shared, she began to reconsider. Love wasn't about being perfect. It was about being real, being vulnerable, and allowing someone to see you for who you truly were. It was during a wellness retreat that Isabella met David. He was a fellow yoga instructor, leading a workshop on mindfulness and self-compassion. From the moment they met, there was an undeniable connection between them. David was different from anyone Isabella had ever met. Kind, gentle, and patient. He had a quiet strength that drew people to him, a calm presence that made others feel at ease. They spent time together between sessions, sharing their experiences and philosophies on life and healing. David was intrigued by Isabella's journey, her resilience, and her dedication to helping others. He admired her strength, but he also sensed the sadness she still carried, the walls she had built around herself. Isabella found herself opening up to him in ways she hadn't expected, feeling a connection that went beyond words. As the retreat came to an end, David asked Isabella if she would like to continue their conversations over dinner. Isabella hesitated, the old fears resurfacing. But there was something in David's eyes, a genuine kindness, a warmth, that made her want to take a chance. She agreed, and that one dinner turned into many more. Their relationship blossomed slowly, naturally. David was patient, understanding Isabella's need for space and time. He didn't push her to share more than she was ready to, didn't pressure her to be anyone other than who she was. With him, Isabella felt safe, seen, and valued. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe she was worthy of love, that she could be happy. David became a source of support, a partner in every sense of the word. He admired Isabella's dedication to her students and her passion for helping others heal. He attended her classes, supporting her in her work and sharing in her mission to create a space of healing and growth. Together, they built a life filled with love, purpose, and understanding. Isabella's journey from darkness to light had not been easy, but it had been worth every step. She had learned that healing was not a straight path, that it involved setbacks and challenges. But she had also learned that she was stronger than she had ever believed. She had faced her fears, confronted her past, and emerged with a deeper understanding of herself and others. She was no longer the scared, broken girl who had once believed she was destined for madness. She was a woman who had discovered her inner strength, her purpose, and her capacity for love. As Isabella stood in her yoga studio, looking out at the students who had come to learn from her, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had found herself, not in spite of her struggles, but because of them. She knew that life would continue to bring challenges, but she was no longer afraid. She had built a community of people who supported each other, who understood that there was no shame in struggling, and who believed in the power of transformation. Isabella's story was not just one of survival, but of transformation. She had turned her pain into purpose, her fear into strength. She had found love not just from others, but from herself. She knew that there was no fatality in life, only choices. And she had chosen to live, to love, and to embrace the beauty of her journey every step of the way. I hope you loved the story. The next video is just a click away, so don't forget to subscribe, like, and turn on notifications. A big thanks, and see you in the next story.